Hello, everyone. So, today we will be looking at the first chapter, which has been uploaded onto your Moodle, and I hope that you've started reading it. So, let me just, dive into what we're going to be doing. We'll be looking at, firstly, we'll be looking at what developmental psychology is about, right? And everything that it encompasses, right? So, at the beginning of the chapter, you have a story about this girl named Sophie. That's a very long story. So, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to tell you an alternate story, even though I would still recommend that you go read the story that's there in the book, right? I will tell you an alternate story and I will just tell you, just to make it easier, I'll just tell you my own story, right? So, let's just say, so basically, Arman here is, a girl, a woman really, who's 30 years old at the moment. But, let's get some basic um, facts about Arman here. So, born in 1990, right? Two parents, father is a professor and mother is a homemaker, a housewife, in other words, right? Then you have, so, from the start, I really enjoyed company or meeting people and getting to know people, right? So, somewhat extroverted, but as a child, I was also extremely shy. It is possible to be both extroverted and shy, to enjoy being around people, but to also, you know, be shy in front of strangers, right? So I was very shy. I loved animals and especially cats. That's something that has stayed with me since forever. Um, I also, so because my father was a professor, our house was always full of books and I really enjoyed reading. That is something that I still enjoy. However, there are certain aspects here that have changed about me. So, for example, when we look at the fact that I was shy, I don't think that I remained so shy as I grew up. I think I gained a lot more in confidence. What else? What else changed about me? I think the extroverted bit, there was a time when I was extremely extroverted where for example, when I was in my O levels, I knew my whole class. I was best friends with everyone. But now I think I prefer to surround myself with a very select few group of people. So I have very few friends. I can count them off my fingers. But at the same time, I like to have a more meaningful bond with them rather than being best friends with everyone, right? Um, so, the reason I'm telling you this story, which is not very interesting, is because, when we look at development, right, what you see here when I tell you my story is that there are certain aspects about me that stayed constant, right? Like, for example, um, that I'm still, to a certain extent extroverted, even if I want to sort of um, limit my circle. What else? That I still really like reading. Um, Another thing is that I still really like animals, right? But there are certain things about me that have changed, right? For example, that, I'm not so shy anymore, right? What else? There are different things that I like to read now compared to what I like to read, let's say, when I was younger. I was very much into fiction when I was younger. Now I like to complement that with a healthy amount of nonfiction. Um, But what else? So, you can say that the extroversion has also changed to a certain extent. You might think that it's ironic that I put extroversion in the constant, but in the change as well. The reason for that is that, even though the definition of an extrovert really is someone who enjoys being around people. So I do enjoy being around people, but not as many people as I did back in the day, right? So basically, to wrap this up, um, listening to my story, what we can conclude is that there are ways in which my life has remained constant, or that I have remained constant. There are ways in which I have changed, right? And this is what developmental psychology is the study of, right? It is the study basically of what remains constant and what changes, right? So when you look at developmental psychology, what it's trying to understand about people's lives is the constancy and the change, right? Now, if you review your own life, right, you look at your own life, this is a theme that you'll be able to identify there as well. That in some areas you'll be constant, and in some areas you'll find that you have changed, right? So, yes, so, now we have the definition out of the way that developmental science basically looks at, individuals' lives and how and what is remaining constant and what exactly is changing, right? One important bit to note here is that, when we say that human development is the study, so basically, human development or developmental psychology is the study of the constancy and the change that people experience through the lifespan, right? So that's also something that is very important. That, constancy and change are something that occur over the lifespan, right? Initially, it was thought that all sorts of changes or all sorts of growth cease to happen at adolescence. But now what we see is that with the changes in life expectancy, right? What is life expectancy? Life expectancy is the number of years you can expect to live. So initially, life expectancy was much lower, but now even in an underdeveloped country or a developing country like Pakistan, life expectancy is easily, somewhere between 60 to some couple of years above 60. So when we have, a lifespan that is much longer than what it used to be in the past, what we do see is that even as people age, right, they do undergo some sort of changes, or their personality does remain the same in certain respects, and therefore, it is important to study this constancy and change throughout the lifespan rather than sort of limiting it at any or capping it off at any one particular point. Right. So yes, some things that you can note or you can think about when you go back to my story here is something like, there are certain questions that you can ask, which are very, very pertinent to the study of human development. So, for example, one of those is, uniqueness, the question about uniqueness. So, what made this individual, which is me, similar to similar in terms of development, right, to others of my age, right, to others who are like me, and what made me different, right? So, what is it about this individual, right, which was similar to others and what was different than others, right? So, that's a question that developmental psychology also looks at, that, what makes individuals different from one another versus what makes them similar to one another, right? Then there are a number of other things you can also think of. For example, what were some of the influences on my life, right? So when you consider the fact that I'm also, presently working as a lecturer in a university, right? So here you can see that, my father, who was a professor, who filled our house with books, and that led to me developing this this love for reading, did contribute in certain ways to me wanting to be a lecturer, right? Or the fact that there were a lot of animals around when I was growing up inside our house, and my brothers really enjoyed animals. So that contributed in certain ways to my love for animals, right? So the point of this is to show you that the environmental context, or the environment plays a huge role when we talk about something like development, right? Because this is something that we discussed in the previous class as well, that people always, right? This is very important to remember, that people always develop in contexts, right? Right. So, what you'll find is that when the book talks about Sophie and her story, the book takes you to this series of questions that we have here. Some of those we've already sort of talked about, but I'll go over them with you so that we sort of get a clearer idea of what the vast area that developmental psychology seeks to encompass through its research. So basically, certain questions that developmental psychology does involve itself with are something like, what determines the features that Sophie shares with others and those that make her unique? Now, these could be physical characteristics, mental capacities, interests, and behaviors, right? This is something that we discussed about my story as well. What led Sophie to retain the same persistent, determined disposition throughout her life, but to change in other essential ways? So, what basically this means that what led Sophie to change in some aspects, but to remain the same in others, right? How do historical and cultural conditions for Sophie, the persecution? So Sophie underwent some, sort of persecution which was targeted towards her childhood home, caused the death of family members. And so basically, she was growing up in Germany, and this is during the period of Hitler. And her family had to flee to the United States. Now, how did this happening in her life affect well being throughout life, right? How does the timing of events, for example, Sophie's early exposure to foreign language and her delayed entry into marriage, parenthood, and career affect development? And what factors, both personal and environmental, led Sophie to die sooner than expected? Now, what you see from these questions is that, these questions are not just aimed at, what was happening in Sophie's personal life. They are sort of focused on that, but they do take into account a couple of other factors, such as they take into account the influence of historical events, right? Right. So basically, what happened to Jews in Germany during the time that Sophie was growing up is a historical event. But developmental psychology does take into account that this historical event plays a role in the development of an individual, which is Sophie, right? And there are other sort of factors as well. Culture is a factor. So here you have, this recognition of culture, of cultural conditions, right? So, you have that as well. Then you have, looking at factors which are personal and environmental, right? So looking at, let's say, something like the availability of resources in an environment, right? For example, something like access to healthcare, or access to immunization, right? All of these can affect development in significant ways, right? Access to knowledge, right? All of these can, and these are all, they form part of a much bigger context than yourself, right? One is your immediate context, which is, your family, and your friends. But then these are much bigger contexts that do you have access to immunization or not? Do you have access to healthcare or not, right? So all of these factors have an influence on Sophie, right? And when we say that developmental psychology takes all of this into account, what we see is basically that developmental psychology, or the field of human development, is essentially an interdisciplinary study. What that means is that it borrows both research methods and findings from a variety of different disciplines, right? Now, these can be, anthropology, right? These anthropology is basically the study of culture, right? So it's when we talk about cultural context, we can talk about anthropology there as well. Anthropology also helps us address some other issues, such as, for example, when we talk about what makes Sophie unique, right? So when we talk about certain developmental phases in people's lives, are those unique to certain cultures or are they universal, right? So anthropology helps us answer these questions as well. Um, you know, History can also be an important factor in studying human development. Then, you have research in psychology, biology, right? All of that. So basically, what I was trying to show you here is that developmental science, or human development, the science of human development, is essentially an interdisciplinary endeavor, right? Which means that it takes or borrows from a field of studies rather than limiting itself to only one field of study, right? Now, how do we create knowledge in the science of human development? So basically, research in human development is fairly, a recent phenomena, but there are theories present within the field of human development that try to explain the phenomena of human development. Now, when we say that there are theories present, what do we really mean by this? What exactly is a theory? What do you guys think? So a theory basically, right, is, an organized and coherent, right, set of ideas or statements, right, that do three things. What are those three things now? So what they seek to do is that they seek to, first of all, describe, right, then explain, and last but not the least, they seek to predict, right? Now, when we're talking about a theory within human development, right? So usually we're talking about a theory that seeks to describe, explain, and predict human behavior or human development, right? So, let's take an example of any theory. Let's take an example of, let's say, the very famous Freud's psychoanalytic theory. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with his psychoanalytic theory. If you feel that you need to brush up on what it was, please go back to your Psych 100 syllabus and look at the book and make sure that you read up on what it is from there, right? So, Freud's psychoanalytic theory, right? Do you think that this theory describes, explains, and predicts human behavior? Let's consider an example. So, an example is that Freud basically broke down development into these distinct stages, right? The first of which was the 0 to 2 stage. which he described as when a child is born to when they're 2 years old as the oral stage, right? Now, this was part of his theory, right? Now, this theory describes what the child will be doing, which is that, they will be extremely interested in all actions using the mouth. So, a child will be very interested in sucking, right? In putting objects, random objects into their mouth, right? So that's a description of a behavior, right? Now, does Freud's theory also explain this observation? Because this is basically just an observation, right? That, a child is sucking and putting objects in their mouth, right? Now, the explanation for this is that because a child, according to Freud, the main contact or the main sort of um, the main point of contact or the way of getting to know the world, right, is mainly through the mouth, right? That is why they are behaving in this manner, that they're sucking and putting objects in their mouth, right? So you have an explanation as well that their main form of interaction with the world is through the mouth, and that is why they are doing this, right? Then do you have a prediction as well? So you do have a prediction as well, which is that, as long as the child is in the oral stage, they will continue to indulge in behaviors that involve the mouth. Right? So in this way, I've given you an example of how this works, how basically Freud's psychoanalytic theory does all of this, that it describes, it explains, and it predicts, right, a particular phenomena, right? So this is, a good theory always does all three of these, right? Now, when we consider theories of human development, right? So what all theories of human development do is that they seek to take some sort of position on the following matters. So the first of these matters is the first of these is that, are there many possible courses of development, right? So are there many possible courses of development, or is there one or just one? So do people develop in the same manner, right? Do they all follow the same course of development, right? Or are there many courses of development, right? So that is one issue that all theories do address. What that means is that some theories say that there are many courses of development, some say that there is just one course of development that is universal to all members of the human species, right? The next concern is that of the relative influence of nature and nurture. And the third is there is development considered continuous or discontinuous? Right. So basically, there are these three issues that you have here, right? And what we establish is that all theories of developmental psychology will address these three issues, right? They will address whether they think that many courses of development are possible, or if there's just one course of development that's possible. They will address whether they believe that nature, which is basically, genetics or whatever it is that you're born with, whatever is innate, right? Does that have more of an influence on development, or is it nurture? Is it your environment, right? So all sorts of theories will take some position or the other with regards to this question, right? Then you have, is development continuous or discontinuous? What does this exactly mean? So let's come to this first, right? Let's start our discussion with this, but I will do that in the next video, right? So I'm going to finish this video off here.